So I woke up to this news on International Women's Day, and it was posted, I think, in one of the Latin American migrants groups. I'm a member of quite a few of them, and the article's entitled "Aged Care Worker to be Deported Within Days After Almost a Decade in Australia." A Perth aged care worker who is set to be deported next week after 9 years living in Australia, says she feels like the country is ungrateful and recklessly kicking out skilled migrants. Liz Armijo came to Perth from her native Chile in 2016 to take up a scholarship at the University of Western Australia, where she studied a master's in health science. After graduating from her degree, Armijo began working for Regis Aged Care, where she has been employed for the past 5 years, including during the pandemic. Armijo told 9news.com.au that she thought her future in Australia was assured when she was invited to apply for one of around 5,000 skilled migrant permanent visas on offer this financial year from the Western Australian government. The aged care worker was told she met all the requirements of the point-based system to be granted the visa. When I received the invitation, it was one of the best days. Everyone says, once you are invited, that's it, you're in. The elation turned to heartbreak, however, on February the 5th, when Armijo opened a letter telling her her visa had been refused and she had just 35 days to leave the country. Armijo said it was a one-word mistake which sealed her fate. In her initial application, Armijo said she had accidentally described her university master's degree as research instead of coursework. She was awarded a total score of 95 points, with the research component contributing 10. However, when the visa application was reviewed in the final stage of the process, the assessor picked up the mistake and took away 10 points, leaving her with a score of 85. The number of points needed to be offered a visa under the state-nominated migration program varies by occupation. Armijo applied for the visa under the occupation of healthcare recreational officer, which is listed by the WA government as needing a minimum of 65 points. Despite easily meeting the minimum points required for her occupation, Armijo was told in her visa rejection letter seen by 9 News that she did not meet the requirements of the visa because of a clause in the legislation which states an applicant's assessed score cannot be less than the invitation score. Armijo said she felt like she was living in a nightmare after receiving that letter rejecting her visa application. I was waking up and I was thinking, this is not happening. It can't be done. I've done everything they asked me to do. Everything. The aged care worker said she was stunned to have been rejected and issued with a deportation notice over such an arbitrary reason. It's shocking that, despite Australia's urgent need for aged care workers, the system is failing to recognise and retain professionals like me. After dedicating nearly a decade to this country, I am now being forced out as if I did something wrong. This is my home, but they're kicking me out. I feel like they used me during the pandemic when we were locked in Western Australia for 2 years. The only thing I did during that time was to work full-time in aged care. I couldn't even take a holiday. Australia is an ungrateful country. It's not fair and it's not okay. Armijo estimated she spent around $80,000 towards gaining permanent residency in Australia, including $50,000 for her master's degree, visas at $5,000 each, and dozens of English proficiency tests costing $300 each. In a parting blow, Armijo said the federal government had cut off her access to Medicare a week before she was due to leave the country. While she had previously held an employer-sponsored visa, which has a pathway to permanent residency, Armijo said she let this lapse after receiving an invitation to apply through a state-nominated program. Applying for another employer-sponsored visa could offer a chance to stay in Australia, but Armijo said she could not stomach shelling out another $5,000 application fee and rejoining the back of the queue, which could take years. I'm not going to keep paying them. she said. It's pride. I can't keep doing this because I've done everything in the past 9 years. I'm tired. I can't do this anymore. Speaking last year, WA Premier Roger Cook said the state had signed an agreement with the federal government to provide 10,000 skilled migration places for the 2024-2025 period, around half of which would go to applicants in the state-nominated migration program, doubling its size from a year earlier. In mid-2025, the Albanese government announced the permanent residency would be fast-tracked. That permanent residency would be fast-tracked for some aged care workers because of the shortage in the industry. This new agreement now in place allows aged care workers to sponsor overseas workers, providers to sponsor overseas workers in direct care occupations. These workers can apply for permanent residency within 2 years. So what's happened here? This does seem extremely arbitrary, but like migrants in this country have such a battle in terms of like obtaining PR, the working conditions under which they endure, and the cost of all these different application procedures and meeting all the requirements. The skills-based test is a fucking lie. It is. And we're doing some work, that is, students and I, on this next week. And I read this story on International Women's Day, and I just thought, why is there so much silence in this country, including on the left, around the rights of migrants? Why aren't they taken up? Why is it that within politics, both on left and right, migrants are just punching bags, to blame for the housing crisis or to assume that they're taking our jobs? Where is the humanity here? Can we not see that injustice is organised through policy, through institutions, through actions like this, which just beg a belief? What is the meaning of multiculturalism in this country if we cannot see through a lens of rights? I mean, there's a waiting period of 4 years if you got PR after the 1st of January 2019 before you can even access welfare. And I've said before, so I'm moving to the welfare issue for people on PR. This is another slice. Basically, you have to stay afloat in an incredibly work unstable environment. There's so much injustice that is related to class and neoliberal economy in this country and government policies that don't meet these gaps and these flaws in the system. I really wish it would get more airtime. Honestly, I do. Another news item I'd mention is something that people are a bit more aware of, at least at my university, and that is the university management taking aim at a trans student from Malaysia who had written slogans pro-Palestine on a whiteboard, I think in a seminar room or lecture theatre. And since the campus access policy prohibits the expression of any kind of form of protest that was brought in June last year without prior permission, she's been charged with misconduct. And initially, this was framed as something that could actually result in her being expelled and sent back to her country of origin, Malaysia, which in her case is a very perilous prospect indeed, because she cannot reliably access HRT therapy, and trans people are often circumscribed in political and government discourse as something undesirable in the country, so she's actually been seeking asylum. So there's been a lot of noise around this case, but the university just came out to say it was an administrative error, but we'll give Luna, that's her pseudonym, the possibility to appeal this charge, but the outcome won't be suspension and deportation, or expulsion and deportation. Even hanging this threat over her head of the possibility of such an outcome would have caused incredible stress and even trauma. It just incenses me that something as draconian as the paternalistic attitude of trying to control any form of speech and also protest on campus can result in these sorts of actions, where presumably someone called her out after writing those slogans, or security guards were in the vicinity and chose to take aim at her, putting her at risk. Where is the university's commitment to diversity in real terms, diversity in terms of freedom of speech, but also for people who are the most vulnerable amongst us, international students, and also trans individuals? It's a combination of disregard and potential targeting on the basis of being trans and being an international. We know how these things play out. They play out also in other institutions where, for example, First Nations people or African Australians may be targeted by police, but also under surveillance constantly. What kind of surveillance regime is our university enacting? I really feel for this student, and I think that people should find ways to speak out against these sorts of draconian measures and the actions that flow from them. In fact, the campus access policy should be revoked and a full apology made to this student, and also redress in both material, moral, and psychological terms. I don't know much more about the student apart from that, but I just think that if we're truly committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to make it just like with multiculturalism, not some defanged thing that's a gesture, a goodwill gesture, and good for the neoliberal environment. No. I mean, we could even ask, to what extent are these sorts of situations examples of how basically in Australia, Trump-like policies and actions have already been underway. We talk about the possibility that they could take off here or be legitimated. Of course, that's true. The question of legitimation through the naturalization of anti-DEI and anti-trans discourses is a looming threat. But the thing is, these forms of punitive and paternalistic actions and structural and symbolic violence, they've always been in Australia since the formation of the nation state, but particularly through the workings of the administrative domain of government and immigration policy, as well as welfare. We must question these things and we must throw them into relief. Just to close, those that have to wait 4 years before being able to access welfare, that money was siphoned off in the Scott Morrison government period in order to be diverted into building up Australia's very well-known offshore prison islands and the infrastructure. Where are our priorities? Robbing from migrant welfare for people who contribute to the country as well, in order to continue to create carcerality and imprison people who are asylum seekers. What kind of logic of the flagrant abuse of human rights is at play here? An indifference by our institutions, whether government or elsewhere.